Asked in line, I always knew where I stood in my family. I just didn't know they'd ever say it to my face. It happened at dinner of all places. My mother set down her fork, looked at me like she was reading off a grocery list, and said it plainly. Your sister's family comes first, you come last. Not cruel, not even raised in volume. Just a fact she'd apparently been carrying around for years, finally spoken out loud because she didn't think it would cost her anything to say it. My father nodded along like she'd just confirmed the weather. My sister didn't even look up from her glass. I didn't cry. I didn't push my chair back and make a scene. I just said, noted, and kept eating. But something in me closed that night. Not my love for them, my willingness to keep proving I deserved it. My name's Renee, and for most of my life, I understood my place in the family without anyone needing to explain it. There was no fight, no single ugly moment, just 1,000 small signals repeated until they hardened into truth. I grew up in a tidy house outside Columbus, the kind of place that looked the same as every other house on the block. But inside, you could feel where the weight sat. My older sister, Claire, had a kind of gravity the rest of us orbited. Dinner conversations bent toward her. Plans were scheduled around whatever she had going on. When she struggled, the whole house mobilized. When she succeeded, we celebrated like it was a holiday. When I did either, it registered as a footnote. I wasn't unloved, and that's the part that took me years to untangle. I was told I was loved, constantly, just in language that quietly asked for nothing in return. You're so capable, you don't need much, you'll figure it out. It sounded like a compliment. It was actually a job description. I learned to read the evidence early. My birthday cakes came from the grocery store on the way home from work. Claire's were ordered 2 weeks out with her name spelled in frosting. When we went on family trips, my suitcase usually stayed in the closet I was saving for school, which was true, but also conveniently let everyone off the hook. At my college graduation, I held everyone's jackets and took the photos. No one really stood where I could find them in a single frame. When I left for community college, there was no scene at a bus station, no tears. Just a hug in the driveway and a reminder to text when I landed. I paid my own way. I picked up extra shifts. I got good at stretching $1 and an hour because nobody was coming to do it for me. And every time I made it work, it fed the story my parents like to tell themselves. She's fine, she doesn't need us. It was a tidy excuse, and I'd been handing it to them for free. Years later, after I moved to Portland for work, nothing in the pattern changed, just the area code. Calls stayed short. Updates about my life got a polite, that's good, then a swift turn toward Claire's latest crisis. I became an expert listener, a steady presence, someone who could absorb a conversation entirely about someone else's life and call it catching up. So by the time my mother said the quiet part out loud, I wasn't shocked by the ranking. I was shocked by how comfortable she was saying it, like she assumed I'd already agreed to it. And in some unspoken way, for years I had. Nothing visibly changed after that dinner. Nobody called to check in, nobody apologized. Life rolled forward as if the sentence had never been spoken, but something in me had quietly rerouted. The requests kept arriving exactly like before, a text from my mom asking if I could take the kids for the afternoon. A casual mention from her that bills were piling up a little, delivered the way you'd mention rain in the forecast. Claire forwarding a bounced payment notice with a laughing emoji attached, like the joke would do the work an actual apology should have done. Nobody ever asked me outright for anything. They'd learned long ago they didn't have to. I noticed for the first time how automatic my old answers had been, sure. No problem, I'll handle it. This time I let the message sit. I felt the old reflex, that tug in my chest urging me to smooth things over before they could turn into anything bigger, and I ignored it. I finished my coffee. I went to work, I lived my actual day. Nothing fell apart, that was the unsettling part. The world didn't end because I didn't immediately step in. There was just silence, followed eventually by a second text, then a more pointed third one. Everything okay? You've been quiet. I was quiet because I was finally paying attention to my own finances, my own time, my own bandwidth, all the places where I'd been quietly redirecting myself toward everyone else's needs. So I started without any announcement, separating things. I moved money into accounts that were only mine. I pulled myself off shared cards. I stopped quietly absorbing small payments nobody had ever actually asked me about out loud, just expected. When Claire texted asking if I could spot her for now, I answered with 2 words, I can't, no explanation attached. The reaction was immediate. My mother called, her voice pulled tight with something that sounded like worry but was really confusion. Is something wrong? You feel distant? I told her the truth, I was just busy. She waited for more, and when nothing came, she filled the silence herself. You know your sister's under a lot of pressure right now. I did know, I'd always known. What I was only now understanding was that knowing about someone's pressure doesn't automatically make it my debt to pay. The real test came on a weekday afternoon, right as I stepped out of a work call. My mother's voice on the phone had that particular strain I recognized instantly, calm stretched thin over something underneath it. We need you to come by this weekend, she said, no details. None needed, I already knew the dialect. Urgency without explanation meant something expensive had gone wrong. The house felt different when I walked in, heavier, the air a little stale, the living room table buried in envelopes and printouts that looked official enough to be frightening. Claire sat rigid on the couch, arms crossed, staring at a spot on the carpet. My dad wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother talked fast, the way people do when they're trying to outrun a conversation. A business venture of Claire's husband's that hadn't worked out. Contracts signed with more optimism than margin. She used the word temporary so many times it started to sound like a prayer rather than a fact. I listened without interrupting, hands folded the way I always sat in that house. Then came the pause, the moment everyone turned to look at me. You're in a stable place, my dad finally said, clearing his throat. No kids. No real overhead, you can absorb this better than the rest of us. There it was, the math that had quietly governed my entire life, finally spoken plainly. Claire glanced up, fear flickering across her face before settling into something closer to relief, like the solution had just walked through the door wearing my coat. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked, what's the plan if I say no? The room went still in a way I'd never heard it go still before. My mother looked hurt. My father looked baffled, like I'd switched to a language he didn't speak. Not helping had simply never been on the table before. I need time, I said, to understand the whole picture. They nodded too quickly, relieved, assuming time meant I was already doing the math on how much I'd hand over. They weren't wrong that I was doing math. They were wrong about what it was for. That night, lying in my old childhood bedroom, I felt something settle in me that wasn't anger, it was clarity. The next morning, I made 2 calls. One to my therapist, one to a lawyer. If I was going to step into this, it wasn't going to be as the family's emergency fund. It would be on terms I actually set. When I came back the following weekend, I didn't bring an answer, I brought a folder. The house had the same tense quiet as before, just better organized, papers sorted into stacks, bent corners from nervous hands. My parents sat waiting. Claire sat beside them, her husband hovering near the doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed in the room where the damage was being tallied. Nobody offered me coffee this time. We're really glad you came, my mother said, her voice carrying that brittle softness she used whenever she needed something but didn't want to ask outright. I sat, set my bag down, and said, let's talk. My father ran through the same explanation as before, the downturn, the bad timing, the contracts. Claire added details about stress, and the kids, eyes glassy, voice catching. Eventually, the explaining ran out of road. My mother leaned forward. We just need help getting through this part once things settle. How much? I asked. A number came, spoken carefully, like saying it gently might shrink it. And what's the plan? I asked. So this doesn't happen again? My father frowned. What do you mean? I mean what changes, not just what gets paid. My mother's face tightened. Renee, this isn't the time to interrogate us. Then it's not the time for me to write a check. The air in the room shifted. Claire sat up straighter. We're family, she said, voice rising just enough to carry feeling without quite tipping into accusation. This isn't about a plan. It's about helping. Helping who? I asked. She looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. Us, and who's helping me? Nobody answered that one. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're in a different position. No real responsibilities. You're stable. You can afford to step in. There it was again, the same equation I'd been solving for them my entire life, the one that always ended with me covering the difference. I can afford to step in, I said slowly, because I spent years building my life like no one was ever going to catch me if I fell. I had to be my own safety net, so I built one. My mother's eyes filled. We didn't know you felt that way. You did, I said, you just didn't think it mattered enough to change anything. The silence that followed wasn't confusion this time, it was discomfort, and it sat in the room like a fourth presence. I reached into my bag and slid the folder across the table. My father opened it first, eyebrows knitting as he turned the pages. My mother read over his shoulder. Claire leaned in, and I watched the color drain slightly from her face. This is a loan agreement, my father said flatly. Yes, with terms. Why are there conditions? Claire asked. Because this isn't a gift, it's structured help. You don't trust us, my mother said, voice trembling. I trust patterns, I said. And this pattern has run my whole life. The terms weren't unreasonable, they were just real. Certain assets sold before any money moved, spending tracked and shared, no new financial commitments without proof they could actually be sustained. Family therapy, not as a suggestion, but as a condition of the agreement. And one line near the bottom that mattered more than the rest. My name, my credit, and my future would no longer be assumed as anyone's backup plan. My father pushed the folder back an inch. This is cold, this is how a bank operates. Then treat me like one, I said. Because when you needed comfort, I was family. The moment you needed money, I became infrastructure. I'd like to know which one I actually am to you. Claire's eyes welled. So now you're punishing us. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm stopping the part where I get punished for being the one who could handle it. If you don't help us, she said, looking between our parents and me, we lose everything. If I help without any boundaries, I said, I lose everything I've spent years building. Nobody argued with that. My mother reached for my hand, then hesitated halfway as if she wasn't sure she'd earned the right anymore. We never meant to make you feel like you were last. I pulled my hand back gently. You did. And then you said it out loud at a dinner table like it was a fact you'd already settled on without me. My father stared at the papers for a long moment. So it's sign or sink? No, I said, standing. It's grow or repeat this exact scene in a year. I told them they had 24 hours. Claire's head snapped up, that's it. And I told her yes, that was it. As I reached the door, my mother's voice cracked behind me. If we say no, are you walking away from us? I paused with my hand on the knob. I'm not walking away from you, I said. I'm walking toward myself. I should have done it a long time ago. When I came back the next day, the papers were signed. No speeches, no excuses dressed up as explanations, just tired faces and shaky signatures. The relief in the room was real. So was the loss underneath it. Something had shifted permanently, and everyone in that room felt it, even if no one said so. The changes that followed weren't dramatic, they were just steady. Assets got listed, subscriptions got canceled. Expenses, for the first time, got tracked instead of assumed. My parents downsized their expectations of me before they'd finished downsizing anything else. Family therapy started a few weeks later, stiff and uncomfortable at first. My father spoke in careful, rehearsed sentences, clearly terrified of saying the wrong thing. My mother cried more than she talked. Claire sat with her arms crossed like accountability was a language nobody had ever bothered to teach her. I mostly listened, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I no longer needed to convince anyone that what I'd lived through was real. It was already written down, signed, and agreed to. Slowly, the panic in our calls faded. The urgency softened into something more honest. Claire learned, awkwardly, to sit with a problem instead of immediately handing it to me. My parents stopped saying we'll figure it out in the specific tone that had always meant you'll figure it out. It wasn't a movie ending. There was no single scene where everything healed. But there was space, finally, space where the guilt used to live, space where obligation had pressed against my chest for as long as I could remember. Back in Portland, my life felt lighter in a way I hadn't expected. I slept better. I stopped flinching every time my phone lit up. When my mother called now, it was to ask how I was doing, not what I could do for someone else. When Claire texted, there was no request folded into it, but the biggest shift wasn't in them, it was in me. I stopped performing the role of the one who's always fine. I stopped trying to earn my place in a family that had already told me out loud where it had ranked me. For most of my life, I thought being last meant I needed to try harder, give more, take up less space until I'd finally earned my way to the front. I was wrong. Being last was never something to fix by trying harder. It was a sign to step out of the line completely and build a life where my worth didn't depend on what I was willing to sacrifice for it. I'm not waiting to be chosen anymore, I already chose myself.